My job as a truck driver has put me in some uncomfortable situations, but nothing compares to what happened at a dry port about 2 years ago. For those who don't know, dry ports are cargo storage areas far from port zones. They are usually busy places during the day, but become extremely quiet and empty at night. It was on one of those nights that something inexplicable happened. I was transporting a load for a client in another city. Since the delivery was scheduled for the following morning, I was instructed to leave the truck at the dry port until the agreed time. When I arrived, it was already past 10 p.m. The place was huge, with stacked containers forming narrow, dark corridors. There were few trucks parked and only a watchman at the entrance. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the sound of the wind passing between the containers. I parked the truck in an isolated area, away from the main lights, and prepared to sleep in the cab. It was a common practice for me, but that night, something seemed off from the start. Around midnight, I was awakened by a strange sound. It was a cracking noise, like metal being dragged. At first, I thought a truck was moving or the watchman was making his rounds. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, everything was quiet. I opened a window and listened for a few seconds. The sound returned, but this time it seemed closer, coming from somewhere between the containers. I grabbed my flashlight and went out to check. I walked to the end of the row where my truck was parked, illuminating the path ahead of me. The cold wind and oppressive silence made the environment even more uncomfortable. It was then that I saw something. Between two containers there was movement. I couldn't distinguish what it was, but it looked like a shadow moving quickly out of sight. I stood still for a moment, trying to understand what I had seen. I decided it must be my imagination playing tricks, and I went back to the truck, but as soon as I entered the cab, I heard another sound. This time, it was a knock on the side of the nearest container. It was a rhythmic sequence, as if someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. I grabbed my phone to call the watchman, but unsurprisingly, there was no signal. I decided to ignore it and try to sleep, but my peace lasted only a little while. The knocks became more frequent and closer, now coming from the side of my truck. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and got down again, this time holding a metal bar that I carried with me for emergencies. "Who is there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. There was no answer, but as I shone the light on the ground around the truck, I saw footprints. They weren't from boots or shoes. They were barefoot, as if someone had walked through there unprotected, even with the cold, dirty ground. The footprints led into the middle of the containers, and against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. I walked slowly, with the flashlight trembling in my hand. In the middle of the corridor, I saw something that made me freeze. There was a container door partially open. The light from my flashlight revealed scratch marks around the entrance, as if someone or something had tried to force its way out. Suddenly, a loud sound came from inside the container. It was a mixture of a moan and a scream, something I had never heard before. I took a step back, but before I could move away, I saw a shadow move quickly inside the container. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I ran back to the truck and locked the cab, breathing heavily as I tried to convince myself that it was all just a result of my fatigue. The rest of the night was a mix of absolute silence and small sounds coming from different directions. I stayed awake until dawn, with the metal bar by my side, hoping that the first light of day would bring some relief. When the sun finally appeared, I got out of the truck to check the area. The footprints were still there, leading to the container, but now the door was completely closed. I decided not to report what had happened to the watchman or anyone else. I just delivered the load and left the dry port as quickly as I could. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was an animal or a hidden person, but something about that place didn't feel normal. And whenever I think about sleeping in a dry port again, I feel chills. Report 2. Working as a truck driver has its challenges, but I've always enjoyed the feeling of being on the road, facing long journeys alone. One thing I quickly learned is that not all places where you park are quiet, especially at night. 2 years ago, I had to spend the night in a dry port while waiting for the time to unload. I thought it would be like any other waiting night, but what happened made me question everything I considered safe. I arrived at the dry port shortly after 10 p.m. The place was huge, with stacked containers forming tall, claustrophobic corridors. The lighting was sparse, with flickering lamps that barely illuminated the asphalt. There were only 2 other trucks parked, but no sign of the drivers. The guard at the entrance seemed disinterested and tired, and the only instructions he gave me were to leave the truck near Sector C and wait for the call. I parked in an isolated area, turned off the engine, and prepared to spend the night in the cabin. The wind blew between the containers, creating a constant and pleasant sound. Despite everything, I tried to ignore the growing discomfort. Around midnight, I was awakened by a noise. It was a high-pitched sound, like metal being dragged on the ground. At first, I thought it was one of the trucks transporting containers, but the place seemed completely deserted. I looked out the window and saw nothing but stacks of containers disappearing into the darkness. The continuous sound, however, was moving erratically, as if something was being pushed back and forth. I got out of the cabin with my flashlight, trying to understand what was happening. I walked towards the area near Sector C, where my truck was parked, but everything seemed normal. The sound had stopped. As I began to return, I noticed something strange on the ground. There were marks, like deep scratches on the asphalt, forming lines that led towards the containers. I followed the marks with my flashlight, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. The marks abruptly stopped in front of a container with the door slightly open. "Is anyone there?" I wanted to say, my voice echoing in the silence. There was no response, but I felt that something was wrong. The air around me felt colder, and a strange smell like rust or something rotten began to spread. I decided to open a door. With great effort, I pushed the heavy metal, revealing the dark interior of the container. At first, I saw nothing, just stacked boxes. But then I heard a low, repetitive sound, as if something was breathing. I pointed the flashlight towards the back and saw a pair of eyes glowing in the dark. Before I could react, something moved quickly in my direction, emitting a guttural sound that made my heart race. I ran as fast as I could back to the truck, feeling footsteps behind me. I didn't have the courage to look back until I got into the cabin and locked the door. Outside, the thing stopped. I stayed still, gripping the steering wheel, trying to control my breathing as I looked out the window. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. It was then that I heard a scratching on the side of the truck, followed by soft knocks on the door. My flashlight was beside me, but I didn't have the courage to use it. The knocks continued for several minutes until suddenly they stopped. I waited until dawn before getting out of the cabin. When I finally mustered the courage, I got out and examined the truck. On the side, there were deep scratch marks, as if something had run its claws there. I looked towards the container where it all began, but it was now closed. The marks on the ground were still there, but I moved to the other side of the port. I reported the incident to the guard at the exit, but he just shrugged and said, "Sometimes we hear things around here. Better not to try to understand." I never found out what happened that night. All I know is that something was watching me, and to this day I have avoided parking in dry ports during the early morning hours. Some places are meant to hold more than just cargo. Report 3. I always considered my job as a truck driver to be calm, even monotonous at times. But there are nights that test your sanity. and one in particular made me question everything I thought I knew about safety and isolation. I parked at a dry port to rest before a delivery, something I had done several times before. However, what happened that night made me reconsider every decision I had made up to that point. I arrived at the dry port around 11 p.m. The place was immense, with hundreds of containers organized in endless rows. The only lighting came from tall poles, casting long shadows on the ground. The guard at the entrance looked bored and just pointed where to park. There were 2 other trucks there, but they were turned off, and I didn't see any other drivers. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind hitting our containers. After parking the truck, I got into the cab and prepared to sleep. I locked the doors, as I always did, and tried to ignore the growing discomfort that the place was causing me. Around midnight, I was awakened by a muffled sound. It was something between a bang and a scratch, coming from somewhere nearby. I looked in the rearview mirror, but everything seemed calm. Maybe it was the wind, I thought. But as I tried to fall back asleep, the sound returned. Now it seemed closer, as if something was moving around my truck. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to check. The air was cold, and the wind made the containers creak slightly. I walked around the truck, shining the light on the ground and the gaps between the containers. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. I went back to the cab and locked the door again, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Shortly after, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was a gentle, rhythmic knock on the cab door. My heart raced. I looked in the rearview mirror and out the side windows, but there was no one. I grabbed my flashlight again and pointed it outside, but the light revealed nothing but the emptiness between the trucks. The knocks continued, more insistent. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The sound stopped for a moment, but was replaced by something even worse. Footsteps. They came from outside, slowly moving around the truck as if someone was circling the cab. I grabbed a metal bar I kept for emergencies and took a deep breath. I decided to step out and confront whatever it was, but when I opened the door, there was no one. Then I was amazed. They were fresh, made in the dust accumulated on the asphalt. But the strangest thing was the pattern, except for a barefoot person, and the marks led into the middle of the containers. Against all my instincts, I followed the footprints. I walked slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand, illuminating every dark corner between the containers. I reached a more remote area where the streetlights were more spaced out. That's when I saw something that made me stop. There was a person crouching next to a container. They were facing away from me, swaying slightly back and forth. They seemed to be wearing torn clothes, and their feet were completely dirty. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying not to show fear. The person stopped swaying and became motionless. The silence that ensued was so absolute that I could hear my own breathing. When the figure finally turned, their movements were strangely awkward, almost mechanical. They turned slowly, and although they were too far away for me to see their face clearly, something about it seemed off. Without waiting any longer, I quickly backed away to my truck. I locked the door, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could. On the way to the exit, I saw something in the rearview mirror that made me freeze again. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. The next morning, I reported the incident to the client, but he just laughed and said the port had a reputation for being strange at night. Since then, I have avoided dry ports at all costs. And on nights of absolute silence, I sometimes think I still hear those gentle knocks on the door of my cab.